A neighbor named Tony lives opposite my house who was as strange as possible. He bred either mice or rats right at home. And at every convenient opportunity, I made fun of him, and it all amused me. But I could not imagine that the result of my actions would be what I will tell you today. Enjoy watching. My name is Eugene, and I have a wife named Ruth. We've been married for 3 years. After our wedding, we decided to buy a house immediately to have our own home and space. The choice was difficult, but we eventually settled on a small 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood in our city. Over the year, we completely furnished it, did expensive renovations, bought furniture, and even prepared a nursery, though still without children. Ruth and I have had issues in this regard. We underwent numerous medical examinations, but no clear problems were identified. Ruth simply cannot conceive, and this has been going on for 2 years. Doctors suggest a possibility of psychological issues, but whenever I bring up this topic with Ruth, she immediately says,
"Eugene, are you mocking me? What psychology? We just need to try harder, and we'll succeed."
I've never pressured Ruth into anything. On the contrary, I've always supported and helped her through uncertain situations. If we can't have a child now, it means it's not the right time. With these words, we decided not to revisit this topic and continued living. Since Ruth took care of the household and I provided financial stability, she had a lot of free time and she dedicated it all to plants. In 3 years, she managed to create a beautiful garden around our house, and we spent around $600 every month on maintaining the garden and all the plants. It was Ruth's favorite activity. Everything was quite good. I thought we were fortunate to get such a wonderful place, but there was one but. Across from our house lived a quirky neighbor. He wasn't mentally ill or anything. He was just strange and even scared me. His name was Tony. I first met him a month after we moved. Tony knocked on our door, wanting to introduce himself and congratulate us on the new home, even bringing a piece of cakey. We thanked Tony, but I didn't invite him into the house because major renovations were underway.
Why didn't you let him in? It was clear he was upset, especially since we're his new neighbors. We need to maintain a connection.
I don't know. I don't like that guy.
Ruth and I had a little argument about showing respect as new residents in the neighborhood, so I had to reassure her. I didn't dwell on this guy, and we continued living as if nothing happened. Every morning I saw Tony tinkering in his garage, and I had no desire to be friends with him because he seemed odd. One evening, as I returned home, I noticed Tony sitting on his porch, using binoculars, to peer directly into our house's windows. By the time I parked my car, he had disappeared, apparently deciding to hide. I didn't let it slide and went to his house. After knocking forcefully, he partially opened the door and asked,
"Good evening, sir. What do you need?"
Why are you spying on my house?
"What house? I was watching birds."
I understood it was a lie for 2 reasons. It was already dark, so there were no birds to watch. And secondly, it was clear he wasn't looking at the sky, but directly into my house's windows. For his lie and spying on my wife while I was away, I delivered a punch, and he curled up in pain. At that moment, from across the street, I heard, "Eugene, are you out of your mind? What are you doing?" It was my wife, who apparently heard the approaching car and decided to come outside. She sprinted across the road at lightning speed and started yelling at me, questioning why I was throwing punches and where my manners were. She took Tony and led him to his house, and I had to go with them. If initially I thought I might have overreacted with the punch being inside his house dispelled all my doubts. I can't say for sure, but there were about 20 rats in his house. I don't know why he had them. Maybe he's a chemist experimenting on them, but it looked horrifying. Ruth sat the injured guy in a chair and started apologizing. I could see that Tony was faking it, and it irritated me even more. Ruth inquired about his well-being, apologized for my deviant behavior, and we went home. The whole evening, Ruth lectured me. She's a professional at it, but she couldn't listen. I tried to explain my point of view and what really happened, but in the end, I had to give up.
I'll bake a pie tomorrow and take it to our neighbor so that, God forbid, he doesn't report it to the police.
From that day on, Tony became my main target. For the next year, I told all my friends, and whenever we met, we would visit Tony. initially with friendly intentions, but then we would start throwing mud at him. I didn't feel sorry for him. He tried to portray himself as a victim so that my wife would pity him. Yuck. So I teased him carefully. For example, approaching my house, I might accidentally drive onto his lawn, or in the middle of the night, I'd go outside and throw stones at his house without causing any damage. If I managed to catch Tony in person, all weapons were unleashed. He couldn't say anything to me, and I always tried to hurt him with something offensive. For instance, he lived alone, without family or parents, and I constantly asked him how they were doing and things like that. If I was with friends, we could insult him as a group, and once we even brought him to tears. I understand that I behaved like a monster, and it's not right at all, but I was fueled by resentment. If Ruth, my wife, hadn't defended the guy who watches over her when I'm not at home, I wouldn't have done anything wrong at all. Whenever I tried to talk to Ruth, she would roll her eyes and say I was paranoid, that Tony is actually a good and kind guy. It infuriated me, and at the first opportunity I would lose my temper, especially on Tony if he happened to be in my sight. The situation worsened when Ruth accused me.
I thought you were done with him. And here you are, being a sneaky coward, fooling around with a guy when I'm not around.
At that moment, I suspected that something was wrong. It turns out that my wife, while I wasn't at home, was talking to this weird guy. I couldn't stand it, and the next morning I knocked on Tony's door to talk, but he wouldn't open the door. So, I decided to leave that idea behind and talk to him properly on another day. When I returned from work the same day, Ruth asked me a strange question again.
Why did you break into Tony's house in the morning?
How did you find out about that? You were asleep at the time.
You don't know me well. Stop hunting our neighbor.
And that's when I lost it. I tried to stay calm and composed. The thought crossed my mind that perhaps, while I was away, Ruth was letting a man into our house who clearly had feelings for her. I apologized to Ruth and promised her that I would stop pursuing the neighbor and leave him alone, but on one condition. Ruth had to keep him at a distance and not let him into our house. She silently agreed to the conditions, and we continued our peaceful life. We've been living in this house for 3 years now, and the events I mentioned earlier occurred during the first year of our life together. After that, our life became peaceful. Tony didn't bother me anymore, and Ruth showed no interest in him. I hoped that I had finally resolved the situation. Tony became completely invisible to me, and in 2 years I forgot about him like a bad dream. Everything was good with Ruth and me. We continued to live and improve our territory. I got a promotion at work, so we started saving money for our long-awaited joint trip. You could say I was happy until one day I noticed something strange. I hadn't paid attention to it before, but when I came home, there was always a mug in the dirty dishes that no one ever used. You know, one of those mugs for guests. I noticed that this mug stood dirty, with juice in it. I didn't bother asking Ruth about it, thinking it was just a coincidence, until I found the same mug, and it was dirty again. Ruth had her own mug from which she always drank any beverage. I never saw her use any other mug, so bad thoughts began to creep into my troubled mind. I didn't decide to talk to her about it, as it would have been quite foolish. But now, every time I return at home, I notice that mug, and it haunted me. In the end, my curiosity got the better of me, and I wanted to know what was happening at home while I was at work. I couldn't think of anything better than to unexpectedly return home. During lunch, I took leave from work and headed home, deciding that parking the car near the house would not be wise. I left it not too far away and walked to the house. Standing at the front door for a few seconds, I opened the door and entered the house. There was an eerie silence, as if no one was in the house. In a couple of minutes, I walked through the entire house and found no sign of Ruth. Then I went to look for her in the backyard, but it was empty too. Calling Ruth on the phone, I found out that her phone was off, and calling was a futile effort. I thought she was probably somewhere in town, shopping. After standing a few more minutes on my property, I was about to go back to the car when suddenly I wanted to visit my neighbor, Tony. I don't know why, but I had a strong desire to find out how he was doing. Before knocking on the door, I looked into the windows, but I couldn't see anything through them because curtains were hanging. After standing a couple more minutes near the house, I knocked 3 times, but no one opened. I made a couple more knocks and also got no result. I was about to leave when I suddenly decided to try the doorknob, and it turned out to be open. I found myself right inside Tony's house, where I hadn't been for about 2 years. During that time, it seemed like nothing had changed, only it was cleaner. Approaching the stairs leading to the 2nd floor, I heard creaking and female moans, which intrigued me. I began to ascend carefully, trying to make it as smooth and cautious as possible due to the creaking staircase. On the 2nd floor there was a corridor, and I saw a room from which the sounds were coming. Peeking inside, I saw Tony having intercourse with some girl. At first, I didn't realize it was my wife, and it was her Tony was with on his bed that day. It was a real shock for me. I stood there like a stone, just watching until it dawned on me that I needed to take action. Before doing anything, I decided to record it on camera, and after putting my phone in my pocket, I stepped into the room. I wanted to attract their attention, deliberately coughing loudly. The rabbits quickly hid. Tony started shaking. I couldn't see his face, but I felt he was scared. Ruth raised her head to see who was there and, with the words, "Oh, damn," lowered her head back onto the bed. I stood there, silently observing their reaction. Deciding I needed more footage, I turned on the camera on my phone. "How are you guys doing? Maybe you can explain to me what's going on?" I asked, barely holding myself together. I understood that getting into a fight was not an option. Otherwise, in the worst case, I would cause serious harm to Tony or end up in jail. I didn't want either of those. In that moment, I realized my marriage had come to an end. No one answered my question, and suddenly, unexpectedly, Tony got up from the bed. At that moment, I was afraid he would attack me, and I ran towards the window, jumping down like a fish, breaking the glass. The level of my shock hit the ceiling. I had seen such escapes in movies, but here a guy decided to escape from his own home, and he even jumped like a fish from the 2nd floor. I recorded all of this on camera, and Ruth started screaming and panicking, saying we needed to call an ambulance. I approached the window, recorded the result of the fall, the body lying motionless, and then stopped filming and called an ambulance. Ruth began to hurriedly pack, and it was evident that she was very ashamed because she didn't say a word to me. I tried to talk to her, but she just said, "It's all your fault." What am I guilty of? I thought to myself, and Ruth rushed out of the house. She went to our home, and I had to wait for an ambulance, so I had to call in to take a couple of days off. First, the ambulance arrived, followed by the police, who began to investigate what had happened. Ruth and I went to the police station to give all our statements, but before that, we hired lawyers. Ruth wanted a separate lawyer, and I tried to convince her that I was on her side, but she didn't trust me, although it should have been the other way around. At the police station, I provided all the evidence I had, including phone camera recordings, and the detective began to look into the case. They sent Ruth and me home, saying that they would contact us in a couple of days. Ruth became very cold towards me, and I sincerely didn't recognize her. It was as if she was no longer my wife. Instead of trying to explain and apologize, she stopped communicating with me and started confronting me. I wanted to talk to her to find out everything, but she refused to communicate, so I had to move to a hotel for a while. A few days later, the detective contacted us and informed us that Tony was alive but had serious injuries. It was good news for me. I still hated him, but on a human level, I felt sorry for him. After all, who in their right mind would jump out of a window? The detective said we still had to wait as the investigation was ongoing, and everything would depend on Tony's testimony. A couple of days later, Ruth called me and asked me to come sign divorce papers. I started yelling at her on the phone, demanding explanations, but she simply hung up. I was beside myself because everything should have been the other way around. Ruth should have received divorce papers from me, and she should have wanted to tell me everything. Instead, I was doing it. Angry, I went to our home and we had a heated argument. Ruth blamed me for everything, saying it was my fault that she cheated on me with Tony. She confessed that she had cheated on me 8 months after we moved into the house, and her affair with Tony continued to this day. While I was at work, she spent the entire day with him and fell in love with him. She was afraid to tell me anything and didn't know what to do. Because of her foolishness and fear, the poor guy is now in the hospital. Ruth said that if I hadn't mocked Tony, she wouldn't have paid attention to him. She shared that from the first day we moved into the new house, Tony immediately introduced himself to her. Initially, she thought he was inadequate, so she kept him at a distance. However, when I started teasing Tony, Ruth began to feel drawn to him, finding many positive qualities in him. In the end, she fell in love with him and was afraid to tell me about it. I was furious that I had been deceived for 3 years, only to be portrayed as the guilty one. Marriage implies communication, where each spouse shares their experiences and sincere thoughts. Ruth violated all vows and lied to me for years. I signed the divorce papers and left the house. Such honesty angered me greatly, and I wanted to do something bad. Knowing that Ruth loved plants and had spent years cultivating the garden around our house, I took a canister of gasoline from my home and started pouring it on all the plants. Then I set everything on fire and drove away. I was in a state where I didn't care about anything. I couldn't come to terms with the fact that I had been deceived for so long. It struck a blow to my ego. I returned to the hotel and started drinking whiskey until I blacked out. Waking up the next morning, I saw 50 missed calls from Ruth. I decided to go to her first to find out what was going on. I saw our house. It was intact, but there was ash all around it. I decided to just drive past. On the same day, the detective called me in for questioning. They had compiled a case and summoned me to clarify some details. The detective informed me that Tony had filed a complaint against me for breaking into his house without permission, and what happened to Tony was considered an accidental incident. I breathed a sigh of relief. The most surprising thing for me was that Ruth didn't file a complaint against me for arson, even though I essentially violated something sacred to her. But I was sure she understood what it was all about. A week later, Ruth and I agreed that I would come to take the rest of my things from the house. While collecting my things, I decided to ask her, if I hadn't noticed the mug, how long would your affair have continued and you would have kept it hidden from me? She replied that she didn't know and deeply regretted it. I don't know why, but I didn't hold any grudge against her. All my negative emotions just left me and I talked to her as a friend, probably because I still loved her. 3 months later, we officially divorced. I wanted to leave the house to Ruth so she could live in it. I thought she would live with Tony, but Ruth started a relationship with him. She believed that her life went downhill because of him and hated herself for cheating on me. In the end, we sold the house and we split the proceeds in half. Since Ruth never worked, I continued to financially support her. We maintained a good connection, but now only as friends. It was hard for me to let go of this woman, so I wanted to keep her close to me. Tony demanded compensation from me in court, and I settled with him. I wanted to forget about this person as a bad dream. In the end, my life continued the same way, only now I was alone, without a girlfriend or wife. I feel somewhat guilty, at least for not spending enough time with Ruth, and she had to seek support from another man. But maybe my wife felt a child in our neighbor, someone she desired, as essentially I mistreated him and she defended him. Thank you for listening to my story.
That's the end of the story. We will be interested to hear your opinion in the comments. Why do you think the main character let his wife go so easily? Why did the wife of the main character commit adultery? We believe that the main character realized that his wife no longer loves him, and what's the point of holding someone if it's not mutual? The main character loves his ex-wife, otherwise he would not keep in touch with her, which is sad. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it. Good luck.